What's up guys, Lifting here. Welcome back to another equipment guide video. In these videos I will give you guys an indication of which stats or properties that are good on different types of equipment. And in this second video we will be discussing gloves. As always, keep in mind that the stats or properties one wants on his or her equipment of course depends on the build that you are running. But the stats that I'm going to recommend to you here in this video is most likely always going to be either good or useful for your character or valuable to sell to other players or characters. And as I said in the previous video, please note that any rare item can only have a total of 6 affixes or properties, where 3 of those are prefixes and the remaining 3 suffixes. In order to get a really good item, you need the 6 most attractive or useful affixes that an item can roll. Besides rolling the right affixes, you also want to roll the highest tier of these affixes. And depending on the item level of the item, you're able to roll different tiers of the prefixes and suffixes. And you could say that in general, the higher item level, the better tier of the affixes you can roll on the item. So let's get started. As any other equipment, the base type of gloves comes in armor, evasion and energy shield base variants. Then in between you have the hybrid armor energy shield, armor evasion and evasion energy shield types of gloves. Depending on the base types, different properties can be rolled on the pair of gloves. And the main difference of these base types is that they can roll different properties. Armor based gloves can roll increases to armor, strength and dexterity. Evasion based gloves can roll increases to evasion and dexterity. And lastly, energy shield based gloves can roll increases to energy shield, intelligence, dexterity and mana. You should know that a pure armor, evasion or energy shield based pair of gloves can roll higher of the respective defensive property compared to the hybrid versions. And for that same reason, most people prefer to either use or buy a pair of non-hybrid boots simply because most people decide to concentrate on only one form of damage mitigation, and for those situations, pure base types are the better choice. So let's take a look at the prefixes and suffixes a pair of gloves can roll. For prefixes, you can see that a pair of gloves, depending on its base type, is able to roll added, minimum, maximum fire, cold, lightning and physical damage, local flat, armor, evasion and energy shield rating, local armor, evasion and energy shield percentage increases, and then local armor, evasion, energy shield increases plus base stun recovery. We then have increased item rarity, increased maximum life, life or mana leech from physical damage, and mana for energy shield base gloves. Once again, remember that a pair of rare gloves can only have 3 prefixes, and the 3 most useful or valuable prefixes on this list is local armor, evasion or energy shield, increased maximum life, and lastly either life or mana leech or added mana. And those are the prefixes that most people will typically look for on a pair of gloves. Now let's take a look at suffixes. For suffixes you have the options of rolling accuracy rating, attack speed, additional strength, dexterity or intelligence, again depending on the base type, increased item rarity, life or mana gained on kill, life regeneration, fire, cold or lightning resistances, which are 3 separate suffixes by the way, chaos resistances, reduced attribute requirements, and increased stun recovery. So the 3 most useful or valuable suffixes here are elemental resistances, and again that's fire, cold and lightning resistances, attack speed, accuracy rating, or added strength, dexterity, or intelligence. And as you can see, gloves are a bit more situational than boots, for instance, that we talked about in the previous video. The reason for that is that suffixes such as accuracy rating and attack speed is obviously only useful for your character if you are attack based. If you are a caster, you obviously don't care too much about that. And now with the idea of what prefixes and suffixes that are valuable on a pair of gloves, let me show you what I consider an ideal pair of gloves therefore would consist of. And take these for instance. Here you have increased armor, evasion and energy shield, increased maximum life, and either life or mana leech from physical damage depending on what your character needs obviously. You then have fire resistances, cold resistances and lightning resistances, which is what we call tri-res. And usually when you roll tri-res for your suffixes, the item automatically increases a lot in value. And then if you have tri-res, with the right types of prefixes, your item can become very valuable. Another example of a valuable pair of gloves would be increased armor, evasion and energy shield, and increased maximum life as before, but instead of life or mana leech this time we have increased mana or added mana. And instead of tri-resistances we have dual resistances, so fire and cold resistances, and for the remaining suffix roll we have attack speed, accuracy or strength, dexterity and intelligence. And while these pair of gloves doesn't have all the 3 elemental resistances as the previous ones, they do instead offer the attack speed and accuracy rating. Now if your character is using Chaos Inoculation, then you obviously don't want to roll life as a prefix on your gloves. An ideal pair of gloves would therefore instead look something like this. Increased energy shield rating, increased or added mana, and either fire resistances, cold resistances and lightning resistances, or instead of the remaining resistance roll, having something like attack speed, accuracy or attribute stats. And another thing to keep in mind that I also mentioned in the previous video is that an item does not always necessarily need to have 6 properties or affixes in order to be good. Having a pair of gloves with life, mana and dual resistances usually sells pretty easily, depending on the tier rolls of the affixes of course. If an item has room for an additional prefix or suffix roll, people sometimes use an Exalt Orb in the hopes of getting that last good suffix or prefix roll. And the benefit of using an Exalted Orb compared to master crafting the item is that with the Exalted Orb crafting you have the chance of rolling the highest tier of the respective affix. And now lastly, let me show you a few examples of gloves on PoE trade that I consider valuable items. And as you can see with these first pair of gloves that I'm going to show you, they have all the ideal prefixes and suffixes that we're interested in. So we're seeing increases to evasion rating, we're seeing life and physical damage leached as mana, so that's the prefixes. And we're also seeing that these gloves have tri-resistance rolls, so fire, cold and lightning resistances. So all in all, an ideal pair of gloves. The only downside here is of course that some of the rolls could be higher to make them really powerful and really valuable. And now these other pair of gloves you see here have increased attack speed, increased maximum life and increased to maximum energy shield. So that's the prefixes. For the suffixes we see that they roll increased maximum mana and fire and cold resistances. So instead of having tri-resistances this time we have dual resistances and the increased attack speed for the suffixes. These pair of gloves are pretty powerful as well. The rolls could be better, but all in all a good pair of gloves. And as mentioned before, gloves can be pretty situational, but as long as you roll life and at least dual resistances on them, they can usually be sold or used by other players. And as I said in the previous video, I would specifically like to give you an answer as to how much you should sell your gloves for, but I'm sorry, I really can't. Just keep in mind that any pair of gloves with movement speed, life and at least dual resistance rolls usually sells pretty easily. How much they sell for depends on how good their tier rolls of the affixes are, and as always prices can vary anywhere from a few chaos orbs to a couple hundred exalts. It's all about the tier rolls and having rolled those right types of affixes. And now as always I will leave a link to poemods.com in the description. In here you can go look up the specific items and see what kind of affixes it can roll and what item level they require to get good tier rolls. Anyway guys, I hope you found this useful. Thank you for watching, and bros, do you even nerd?